Today's class is called What is the Bible? Class 43. Should say Joseph enslaves the Egyptians. Speaking of typos, Joseph enslaves the Egyptians. Genesis 47 verses 1 through 26. And I named it Joseph enslaves the Egyptians because that is what happens, as we will see. But first, some recap. Last week, we read of Jacob's relocation to Egypt along with his sons, servants, and livestock. The beginning of chapter 47 describes in more detail the transition period, and it occurred to me as I was preparing for this lesson that I perhaps should have included these verses with last week's lesson because it really is a continuation of the telling of that story. But either way, we'll pick up at verse 1 of chapter 47, which goes, "So Joseph went and told Pharaoh, 'My father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen.' From among his brothers, he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, 'What is your occupation?' And they said to Pharaoh, 'Your servants are shepherds, as our ancestors were.' They said to Pharaoh, 'We have come to reside as aliens in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, because the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now we ask you, let your servants settle in the land of Goshen.' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know that there are capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock.' As we discussed last week, Goshen is in the Nile Delta part of Egypt, where it would have been fed by the waters of the Nile, spread out over a fairly wide expanse as the river would branch out before it went into the ocean. And you also may recall from last week's lesson how Joseph instructed his brothers to tell the Pharaoh that they were shepherds so that they may possess the land best suited for the purpose, which was Goshen. Here, Joseph himself makes the introduction and serves as the intermediary between Pharaoh and his family. And they tell Pharaoh, as they were instructed to do, that they are shepherds, which was, as we read last week, apparently a degrading occupation, one that was looked down upon. But Pharaoh gives no hint that this is a degrading occupation, and he receives them kindly and gives them, quote, the best part of the land. All goes as planned. An arrangement has been made that is beneficial to Joseph's family as they have a place to graze their livestock. Once more, the arrangement benefits the Pharaoh. As we noted last week, them being somewhat off the beaten path would have been a good diplomatic move because the people would not have felt threatened by the occupancy of these new people from the outside. But also, Joseph's family are asked to oversee the royal livestock, and so these bonds between the house of Pharaoh and Joseph's house are even tightened. They're knit more tightly together as now Joseph's family are responsible for the Pharaoh's livestock. Fritham writes, going beyond previous conversations, he, being Pharaoh, offers to allow the capable ones among them to oversee his own livestock, guaranteeing the security of the family under pharaonic authority. As I was saying, this ensures the safety of Joseph's family still more so. They're in charge of Pharaoh's sheep. Joseph again displays his tact and wisdom in making these arrangements. It's his part and parcel with Joseph we've known throughout this narrative, where he seems to always know what the best plan is. And in this case, everyone seems to benefit. Everyone wins. Verse 7. Then Pharaoh brought his father Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the years of your life?" Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my earthly sojourn are 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life. They do not compare with the years of the life of my ancestors during their long sojourn." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. The fact that Jacob blesses Pharaoh is mentioned twice. God's blessing of Israel's neighbors through their ancestors is a central theme of Genesis, as we've read in times past, where Abraham is told he and his ancestors will be a blessing to the nations, and we've seen times where they have been a blessing to the people they have interacted with. And here we see more of the same. Abraham's descendants blessing the nations. Now, Jacob's words in verse 9 may seem odd. A man who is 130 years old and who lives an additional 17 years describes his years of life as few and hard. Hard, I'll allow him, but few. What gives? Well, Jacob's words, writes Salhamer, Jacob's words appear to be a deliberate contrast to the later promise in Deuteronomy to the one who honors his father and mother, namely that he will live long and that it will go well with him in the land. Deuteronomy 5:16. Remember, Jacob, who deceived his father and thereby gained the blessing, must not only die outside of his own land, but also leads a relatively short life comprised of difficult years. And so 130 years is a long time to be alive, but contrasted with the records of Jacob's ancestors, this is a shorter period of time. And as to the difficulty that he has faced, he now seems to chalk it up to the fact that he had dealt deceptively with his own parents. You remember that Jacob tricked his father out of the blessing that he did in fact receive. And as a consequence, now he will live his last years outside of the land of promise. So while one might take issue with Jacob describing his years as few, one can appreciate the struggles that he's endured. Salhamer writes, from his own words, we see a final recompense for Jacob's earlier actions. Abraham obeyed God and lived long in the land. Genesis 26, verse 5. But Jacob's years are short and difficult. In spite of his final verdict on his life, the narrative goes on to show that he lives out his remaining years in the best part of the land. And Joseph, his son, provides for him and his household. So all in all, this is not a bad end to a life, though it falls short of what was promised to his ancestors, who were told that they would live long in the land. That is, the land promised them and their progeny, that is, back in Canaan. And this lament will later prompt Jacob's request that we'll discuss next week, his request to be buried in the land of his ancestors. So, verse 11. Joseph settled his father and his brothers and granted them a holding in the land of Egypt, in the best part of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had intended. Notice the change in name there, Ramses. It's talking about the same place, the land of Goshen. But here we discover it's the land of Ramses, verse 12. And Joseph provided his father, his brother, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. Here is foreshadowed the situation the Israelites will find themselves in at the beginning of Exodus. Ramses II is the Pharaoh written of in the Exodus account. These verses place Joseph's descendants in his neck of the woods. The land of Ramses is another name for the land of Goshen, the northeastern Nile Delta. In the 13th century BCE, the Pharaoh Ramses II made a city in this area, Tanis, his capital, writes Hybert. It foreshadows the time when the Israelite slaves will build the city of Ramses. And so we're getting a little glimpse into what is going to happen in the next book of the Torah. But now comes a story that I must confess I don't recall ever hearing a lesson about in church, Sunday school, or a sermon preached on. And as a matter of fact, when I reread Genesis in preparation for these lessons, probably 10 months to a year ago now, I could not remember the story. It's not a part of the narrative that is repeated very often, and it's difficult to understand what moral teachings we're supposed to get from it or what really the point in its telling is. And so we'll be talking about these things as we move forward, and I think we'll discover that it's not exactly clear what we're to make of the story, and also that it's something of a mixed bag as to how people have interpreted Joseph's actions. And so I'm going to read the story that comes next just straight through, with very little commentary. And then at the end, I will read some of the things that have been written about it. And then we'll bring it out for discussion because there's quite a lot to unpack here. So verse 13, this is a sort of a new story within the Joseph story. And it begins, now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money from the land of Egypt and from the land of Canaan was spent, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give me your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." I'll just pause to note, why would they give away livestock, which is also food? Well, without grain, you cannot keep the livestock alive. And so I guess they could have eaten the livestock, but then they would be in the same place minus the livestock. It's better to get grain to feed the animals and to live than to eat the last of your animals and then to still have none. And then when you are fed, should you receive grain, not have the animals. So that's why. That's why they still have the livestock. Verse 17. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. That year he supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Shall we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We with our land will become slaves to Pharaoh. Just give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." Notice it is the people that make the offer of their land and their persons for the sake of food. And I guess given that there was a famine and the consequence for not having food would be death, I suppose this seems reasonable. At the same time, how will Joseph respond? Will he take them up on this offer and indenture them to the Pharaoh? We will see fairly quickly, actually, in verse 20. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them from the one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them before they did not sell their land. Therefore, they did not sell their land, they being the priests. Hybrid rights, royal grants of land to temples and their priests were common in the ancient Near East. As a matter of fact, it was about as best an occupation as you could have in many instances to have been a priest, because the temple and the rituals and life around the temple were often subsidized by the regional governments and also from the collections of tithes and offerings. Verse 23. Then Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you. Sow the land, and at the harvest you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." They said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the 5th. The land of the priests alone did not become the Pharaoh's. So these verses are a sobering reminder that the whole while the famine is in full swing. It's hard. It may be easy to forget that as we were becoming preoccupied with the plight of Joseph's brothers and the rigmarole that he put them through. But the famine is still in the earlier years, in fact. And while the focus of the narrative has been on the plight of Joseph's family, now the focus turns to the people of Egypt at large. Hybert writes, "In order to survive the most difficult years of the famine, Joseph centralizes Egypt's economy to secure sufficient production of the entire population. The story emphasizes Joseph's wisdom as a shrewd administrator." And the emphasis on wisdom as a shrewd administrator is mine. I put that in italics. And I emphasize the bit about Joseph's actions, highlighting his shrewdness and his wisdom, to make the point that by and large, his actions would have been interpreted at the time as such, as shrewd in that he himself is benefiting from this. Specifically, the Pharaoh is benefiting from this, but as a secondhand man, he's benefiting from this. And I don't know if you noticed the detail that he's collecting the livestock, but who's caring for the livestock in Goshen? It's Joseph's family, and so he is benefiting from this. But the wisdom comes in that the people do live, and they apparently seem grateful for this. They note in verse 25, "You have saved our lives." And so his actions would have been interpreted at the time as shrewd and wise, considering the stakes. The very survival of the people in the land is on the line. The people are facing starvation, and Joseph offers them a path to survival. And so in this context, that explains the words of, if not gratitude, at least acquiescence to the arrangement that we read in verse 25. But still, the actions of Joseph seem harsh, and commentators on this passage seem divided into two camps. And I know there's more nuance. Some have a foot in both of these camps, but to simplify things, one camp finds Joseph's actions troubling and unnecessarily despotic. Others find his solution the best possible option given the hard situation the people find themselves in. This is the view expressed in the Hybert quote from the previous slide, where he's described as wise. But Handel offers us one example of a more harsh critique. He writes, "This unusual section tells of Joseph's brutal strategy during the 7 years of famine following his preparations during the 7 years of plenty. Joseph first acquires for Pharaoh all the money in Egypt and Canaan." All the money. Get your mind around that concept. The king has it all. Then he acquires all the Egyptians' livestock and land, and even the Egyptians themselves as slaves. This section may explain why all of Egypt was regarded as Pharaoh's personal property with special provision for the priests. There is perhaps some irony or poetic justice, writes Handel, irony and poetic justice in Joseph's enslavement of all the Egyptians before Pharaoh enslaves all the Israelites. And here's my words, Heath Jones. "I must confess, I did not remember this passage when I reread it several months ago. As I read it, I was offended at Joseph's strategy, and the irony was not lost upon me that the descendants of Joseph would find themselves enslaved in the land where their ancestor Joseph had made these conditions possible in the centralizing of power under the Pharaoh. Joseph's centralizing of power under the Pharaoh gave Pharaoh the ability to abuse the Israelites centuries later, so this would all come full circle. However, other commentators are more generous in their views of Joseph's actions in the story. For example, take Frithams. He writes in 47:13 through 26, the passage that we're considering, "We see comparable, if more concrete, blessing activity on Joseph's part." So these happenings are labeled as blessing, an extension of the blessing that Abraham's descendants are meant to bring the nations. That's my parenthetical insert. The quote goes on. "This Israelite, whose authority extends over a non-chosen people, responds to their cries for bread." The links between this text in 45 verse 7, which reads, "God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors," show that the preservation of life remains important for all people. The issues of life and death for Jacob's family over the course of the narrative have become issues for the Egyptians. The place to which Israel has gone to seek relief is now itself caught up in the famine's effects. Joseph, in effect, returns the favor. The people of God are here engaged in seeking to alleviate the devastating effects of the famine on people who stand outside of their own community, but working in and through a variety of governmental structures. Their methods may not be a model of perfection, but taking the opinions of the hurting people themselves into account, they enter into the fray on behalf of life rather than death. And I write, Heath Jones writes, "There may be something in Frithem's view on the matter, but one still may wonder what the outcomes may have been if Joseph had simply given the people grain whilst allowing them to keep their money, livestock, land, and freedom. Perhaps Joseph's actions were a political necessity if he were to remain in good graces with the Pharaoh who stood in the role of God King. It was certainly expected that Pharaoh's underlings would shore up the monarch's power and wealth, and Joseph's actions certainly did this, and his esteem in the Pharaoh's eyes would certainly have been bolstered. The end result would be that Joseph's family would have even more security and safety in Egypt, at least in the short term. So I think we're meant to take this story as another evidence of Joseph's acumen, wisdom, insight, and his ability to plan and work within the Egyptian constructs. The same abilities that gave to his rise to power are here on full display, is what I think. Closing thoughts. My first reaction to Joseph's actions in Genesis 47, 13 through 26 was overwhelmingly negative. I felt that they were out of keeping with a servant of God. Why not just give the people the food that they need? Why sow the seeds of possible resentment, seeds that could grow into malignant weeds in generations to come, as apparently they did? On some level, I still feel this way. However, after considering the matter further, I am less strident in my condemnation of Joseph's actions. And this is a move in my interpretation that really is as new as this week as I've been studying this passage. Remember, this is all happening in the context of a famine. Keep that as the backdrop. The very survival of the people is on the line. Perhaps Joseph's harsh actions were the only way to ensure that food would find the people whilst preserving the institutional apparatuses that made the food distribution possible. One could imagine if Joseph opened the grain bins and gave the food away to every single person, how the Pharaoh, who possibly operates under a different set of, he's the God King. So how does a God King think? You could imagine him being upset if there was no direct benefit to the monarchy and to some increase in his power. So keeping that in mind as we read the story, also consider that Joseph's actions were perfectly in good keeping with his role as Pharaoh's right-hand man. Perhaps here we have an example of Joseph doing his job exceedingly well. I doubt that ancient readers would have been as troubled by his actions as modern readers, especially when you consider that the lives of all of the Egyptians were saved in the end, even if it was at the cost of all that they owned and their own very autonomy. Taking in the larger context of Joseph's narrative, we are probably meant to read the story as another example of Joseph's wisdom and God-given acumen, as I alluded to earlier. But I'd like to open it up to discussion because I really am curious as to what you think. What do you think, and how do the actions of Joseph in Genesis 47, 13 through 26 leave you? And before we move into that discussion, I will just say that next week we will be considering the end of Genesis chapter 47, verses 27 through 31, and then we'll be considering the entirety of Genesis chapter 48. Here are the sources. And now I will bring it back for discussion. And I guess I did open with the question, what do you think? But before we even get to that, how many of you were familiar with this story before this week?
Well, I've been familiar with it I've read it before, I'll put it that way, but since it's not a common story that you hear, you don't oftentimes think of it. So I'm kind of like you in your situation on this one, but what I would definitely say is that, yes, I can see where people would have a little trouble with this because if they, I don't agree with slavery, number one. I believe that people should be able to work and earn their pay. But second of all, if he was going to enslave them, he should have said during the famine. Just do it during the famine, and afterwards, you can have your land back and everything else. If he was going to enslave them.
Right. My opinion on this text shifted some. I first, when I read this, it was amazing. I'm very familiar with the Torah. I would not say I am very familiar with the entirety of the Bible. I've read the entirety of the Bible, but there are some portions of it that I read as if for the first time because, it's a lot to take in. But with Genesis, I was pretty confident that I knew the gist of most of it. But somehow this story fell through the cracks. And I know I'd read it before, but I was surprised by it. When I first read it, I was really upset about what Joseph did. And after some consideration, I'm not happy with what happened, but I'm what I said at the end. I'm less strident in my condemnation of his actions because, he was working within the Egyptian empire. And also this idea that all persons as individuals should have personal autonomy and freedom is not an assumption that they shared back in their time and in their day. They lived in a different a framework that assumed that you had a place within your people, and you lived on through your ancestors' good names. And so, given those assumptions, it would have been read differently in times past. But
And that makes sense too. Even with Jesus, I mean, even during his time, ancestry was extremely important, it seems, to their way of life. I mean, you read the story, and I believe it's Matthew chapter 15, the teaching of the ancestors, where Pharisees walk up to Jesus and they say, well, why don't your disciples do this? This is what our ancestors did. And of course, he calls them out on their hypocrisy. And, it seems like that would be kind of fitting in that regard, even up to the time of Jesus.
It still seems to me if the food was available, in the end, he kept giving them food. Then if he would have done that and they could have still maintained their land and everything, it would have been fine. But it seems like there's an ulterior motive here, the way he went about it. And it was kind of slick, we'll do one thing at a time and, kind of like an emperor, how they rule.
Yeah, he was number two. He was emperor too. So he's fulfilling his role.
That was the part of the story. I wasn't thinking about Joseph so much, just I had a flash on things that are going on today and how people are interpreting the government. Not that I interpret the government this way, but there's an element in our society today that doesn't want our government to do anything for them, from them, because they feel like they're going to be enslaved. Now, that's a really kind of out there sort of interpretation of it, but you hear that. You hear factions of people in our society say, well, we don't want, your vaccinations because, you're accepting help from the government that's going to ultimately enslave us. We don't want your Medicare, Medicaid, whatever, because these will, that's just the big government getting bigger, having control over our lives. And this story just kind of, those images are popping into my mind as this story was kind of unfolding. And So
I found myself thinking along those same lines about what's happening now and how is what everything that happened and is still happening, how's that going to be perceived in years to come? And it'll be colored by what is the outcome of those things. We don't know the outcome of some of those things yet. So, I think we see things through a lens of our experience. I think that the fact that the people came and offered their cattle, offered themselves, offered their land, shows how desperate they were to have food. And if they had just been given the grain, they would have had to have fed the cattle. They wouldn't have been able to grow anything, it doesn't seem like, because otherwise you wouldn't have a famine if you could actually grow something. So they were really desperate.
Well, they must have been able to grow something because they gave him the seed and they were supposed to get a fifth back. And so there was a small portion of things being able to grow, but not in the normalcy that it would have been.
I thought maybe that was toward the end of the 7 years.
Yeah, that's what I thought too, Janet. Yeah.
It's more of an edict that's supposed to go forward. It says, to this, things are this way to this present day, Pharaoh receives 1/5. So from the vantage point of the story's writing, it assumes that this is still something like a tithe or a tax that goes to the Pharaoh. I have my problem with what happened is all of it, all of the money from Egypt to Canaan, all of the livestock, all of the land, and even the persons. You could have easily seen, as is the case if you draw corollaries with our own modern times. I feel perfectly happy to pay taxes that go into school systems and roads and fire departments and things that are mutually beneficial to all society. And I'm not being asked to give everything I have. I'm being asked to give a reasonable ratio of what I make. And I'm a fan of that. I'm a proud taxpayer in that sense. If my stomach was empty and my children were starving, and I was told, well, I guess in this case it would have been my idea, but if it was acceptable to the powers that be to take everything, well, they really have you over a barrel at that point, and it just seems too much. Now, in the end of the story, one of the details that I missed in the first reading is that as it comes full circle, they are able to retain 4/5 of what they can produce themselves. And so maybe in the balance, what you end up with is a situation not very much unlike ours, where if you don't give the Pharaoh 1/5, he owns you. Now, I would reframe it differently in our own times, but if I don't pay my taxes for any number of years, there will, to the degree to which that isn't some form of indentureship is debatable, but I definitely think I can see why our minds would draw a corollary, but again, that's the end of the story, and what I really take issue with is what builds up to that, where by the time this is all said and done, the God King, and with his right hand man, has solidified all power in the land and all resources into one specific place. And I think we're meant to tie this with the story that we find in the beginning of Exodus, where the tables are turned. The people are still in the land of Goshen, which turns out to now be the land of Ramses, where he's moved the capital, and he doesn't remember Joseph. And the apparatus that was put in place in this story that benefited the Israelites as they were able to become the caretakers of the king's livestock. Now is subverted, and they find themselves building the new capital that Ramses would commission.
I still think at the time when they had nothing left, he just could have given them grain. After all, where did he get the grain in the first place?
Yes. That's my
It's
question.
almost like, this is your interest on what you gave us. Now we're going to keep you alive by giving you back the grain that you grew. I still have an issue with this part of the story. As I said last week, it's not a thing. But Connie, something you said that we know we learn from our experiences, but I also think we learn from history. I think when we look at what has happened in other places around the world, that we can learn from that as well as just our own experiences.
Well, and I think we do, but I think I consider that part of the experience.
Oh, okay.
My experience. I know what I've learned. I know what I personally experienced.
Yeah.
I kind of was encompassing all of that.
Yeah. I do think this nation is headed for socialism. It's not anything I want. It's not anything that I think God wants, but I think that's where we're headed. We have not upheld all of God's laws, and we're going to suffer for it.
Can I ask a question about the length of life of all these people. I mean, what is the understanding about that? People living to be hundreds of years old, and they're now dying early at like 147. Years like that.
You put me on the spot, and I was more
Well-
suited to answer that question back in like lesson 3, 4, 5 of this long foray into Genesis. But biblical scholarship gives us a spectrum. There are those who take the years listed as absolutely literally. So, who's the longest lived man? Well, that would be Methuselah, right? Because the genealogy says he lived
969.
969 years. Others who are wanting to take the numbers seriously, but don't believe that humans could have ever lived that long in history based on our biology, would say that every name in the genealogy represents like a household that would span several different generations. And so it would be to name the length and time that the household existed, would span several different generations, is one I remember learning about in my undergrad. Others don't take the numbers literally, no more than they would take some of the numbers that were listed in battles, for instance, where, numbers are so, like, sometimes in battles were numbered in the hundreds of thousands, when geographical evidence would suggest that there wasn't the population to sustain a battle that large. And they might believe that those who were keeping these genealogies were trying to square the timeline with what was believed to have been the timeline, or that it is also meant to another interpretation, without taking the numbers literally, could interpret the longevity of the years of these people, which would decrease over time. And then they would be told that they wouldn't live past 120, but then they continue to live past 120, but it sort of peters out by the time of Abraham, and then going forward from there. That is meant to be seen as a distancing from the garden, where it was supposed to have been an Edenic time before death. And so the decrease in the years would have been sort of a symbolic of that. There's a variety of options.
Yeah, I've been taught, or have come across the opinion, that some think these people that live the longest, up into the hundreds, the 6 to 9, whatever, this was before the flood. And before the flood, it never rained. The earth was watered from below. And at that point, it changed the environment of the world. And people did not react in the same as they did before, because I think it was at the firmament that went away or whatever. I don't remember that part, but that's part of the reason. And then gradually the lifespan of an individual went down. And I think it's someplace in Proverbs where it says that the lifespan of a human is 70, or perhaps that if you're blessed, 80. So that's pretty much where we are today, with an occasional person living to be 100 and something. But whether that's a true assumption, I don't know or not, but that was something that was told to me years ago.
Well, we talked at the very beginning of these lessons about how these stories only very recently were people tried to interpret them as historic happenings on an historic timeline, when before they could operate with a parabolic meaning, just as Jesus told parables with deep truth and wisdoms, irrespective of the history, what happened and when it happened. And as with interpretations as to the meaning of the flood or the significance of longevity in the genealogies, you don't have to believe that this is describing a history. You can get lessons from them in a parabolic meaning. But there's room within Christianity for people who interpret them quite literally and take the stories at face value in faith. And both of those views are expressed in Bible commentaries by thoughtful people trying to engage these faithfully. But I've heard that before too, Sue. I think that's probably what was taught. I don't know where I first encountered it, if it was youth group or Sunday school or in my Bible classes at Indiana Wesleyan University, where that was a view that was held by some.
I think I heard it in BSF.
Sorry if I've forgotten something that you said earlier in the study.
Oh, no.
No,
I said I've been.
But anyway, my second question is, that they talk about how fruitful the descendants of Jacob were here in the land of Goshen, and they multiplied exceedingly. And then when you get to Exodus, you find out that they had become too populous and they were kind of a threat to the Egyptian. So anyway, who did they all marry? I mean, were they, they had the 12 brothers, but then surely they weren't marrying, intermarried. I mean, and then they had all the people who were taking care of the flocks. Is that supposedly how they?
Joseph took an Egyptian wife. Moses took an Egyptian wife, Zipporah. I mean, let's be realistic. Of course, there was intermarrying. This happens every time there's, anytime two peoples are in close proximity, the question becomes what is acceptable amount of intermarrying, and that's where racism and bigotry often get codified in law.
So really, the Egyptians were marrying the.
These are all Semitic people. I avoided on purpose pictures that had Jacob going before the Pharaoh in a pasty white face, with the Pharaoh being a dark skinned person. These were all Semitic peoples. These are all people that would have been very similar in skin tone, and have shared a shared sense of worldview and cosmology. Something, again, we talked about at the beginning, how the cosmology and the view, you mentioned firmament, Sue, where there was this dome that held up the waters and that the earth was flat. That was a shared assumption across the board. And I only bring that up to point out there were lots of similarities. And so people would have been aware that they had a shared history. And sometimes that shared history, it becomes obscured in the tribal tales that try to justify a people's autonomy or to explain the differences or perceived differences between one tribe and the neighboring tribe. But I guess to answer, that's a long answer, but to answer your question, they intermarried, of course they would have intermarried.
So then if the Israelites intermarried with the Egyptians, those people all became called Israelites. You think?
Here's where in Egypt, there is only one reference to the Hebrew people on a stylite, which was a post that a pharaoh would put up after they'd went out to war. There's no record of the Israelites being in Egypt outside of the Bible, at least in the way described in the Bible. What's clear is that the writers of the stories of the Israelites being in Egypt, they knew Egyptian culture. There's enough tells to tell that they were familiar with the place that they were writing about. And so you can have a good, people who have trusted in the Bible's authority would say, well, this is evidence enough that the Israelites were in Egypt. According to the Egyptian record, you just have this one stylite that just says that the certain pharaoh went out and laid the Haberu, as is pronounced, completely to waste. They are no more, as the way it ends. Well, they weren't no more. Obviously, this is the way that kings talk, or go out and beat up on another tribe. I bring that up to in answering this question of like who are we talking about in the book of Exodus. I think you just have to take the story as it's been received at face value to get from it what we are meant to get from it. The question about the logistics of who married who and what assimilation would have looked like. And I don't think those are questions that are accessible to us as an historical record outside of the stories in the Bible. I guess it's not answered.
I do know that when they left Exodus, the scripture tells us that many Egyptians went with the Hebrews. So could that be if you had the intermarriages, then mom and pop of Sobai went with them also? So, I mean, that's, to me, sounds logical that would happen, that Egyptians that had married into the Israelites, that their families might very well have gone with them when they left.
And they brought with them some of the Egyptian gods.
Oh, yes.
So these would have been, per our discussion about household gods earlier in these lessons, these would have been household gods that would have been brought into the homes of the Israelites, probably by way of marriage. Similar to Rachel stealing the family gods when she left Laban's land, some sort of similar thing. These would have been cherished family heirlooms, and would suggest intermarriage and assimilation. And I've said before too, Moses's name is Egyptian in its origin. Moses. It's the same sort of. So there's quite a lot there. There's another, I guess, clue in the text there. I mean, I guess when the princess pulled Moses from the water in the Nile in the basket, they were able to identify it as a Hebrew child, but obviously he could have passed for Egyptian if he was going to live in the house of the queen, of the princess. So are there any other comments or things to note?
There's no record of this famine historically.
There are records of famines historically. I don't know how to place those on a timeline. I mean, this would have been, if we were to take the biblical narrative in the timeline given there, at least 3,500 years ago, perhaps 4,000 years ago. So
there is a possible geological explanation for the parting of the Red Sea. I'll share that when we get to it. Did you know about that?
Yeah, well, it's this. This is gonna, for those who love the Charlton Heston. Let's not do that today.
Okay, well, do want to do that today, but that was very exciting. Yeah. I had it from the words of a geology professor, so it's very exciting.
Joseph is supposed to have died at 1805 BC, and Moses was born supposedly at 1526 BC.
So some centuries have passed.
Yeah. So
while we're on the topic too of evidence of Joseph adopting the walking like an Egyptian, as a pun that we played with a few weeks ago. What did he do with Jacob's body when he died?
Oh, he went back Canaan. Jacob
He did, but before that, he embalmed him.
Well, that's true. Yes.
Which is
they had a wake or whatever.
The Egyptian practice of embalming was not a one that the Hebrew and the people in Canaan shared. In a wake, too, as described, is also evidence that the writers knew Egypt well, because what you would do. This is the last I'll say because we can't get too much into the weeds, but I love Egypt. So I've said I've bought several courses on Egypt, and part of the embalming process included this, what's described as a wake, this period of time where the body would have sat packed in talc and dry powders to dehydrate and preserve. And this would have happened in a tent, and they would have been set out for a number of weeks. So what's described in Jacob's burial preparations is it's Egyptian in essence. Well, we let that discussion went lots of different directions, and I'm grateful for it. And thank you for your questions and your comments and your time here today.
Yeah, we made it through without any interruptions.
Yeah, with no internet interruptions. You're right. And bye everyone.
Bye.
And I'll see you soon. Take care.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.